Good morning, Bharat. I'd like to thank the conference organizers, Dr. Banerjee, for hosting this. SANSAD and SFU are great hosts, and their Alliance of Progressive Organizations are putting on a wonderful 3-day conference. I'm going to talk about the Armenian genocide and the emergence of the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide. We should remember which genocides are remembered and written about and which ones are not, and why. And I appreciate the efforts of the conference organizers to try to broaden the scope of what genocides are written about and discussed. And I would just remind you that the Armenian deportations and massacres that began in earnest in 1915 and continued during World War I and even in some ways after, was much discussed in the world press and amongst the diplomats and even military personnel in 1915 onwards. And we have the famous declaration by Tsarist Russia, France, and Great Britain warning Turkey against the crimes against humanity that were going on. And in May 1915, we have the first major introduction of the concept of crimes against humanity. Now, there was much that was written about. There was much that was done to help the orphans of the genocide. There were over 100,000 orphans, and they were helped from one year after another throughout the Near East. Near East Relief was a major American organization to help those who were helpless. But as we went from the 1920s into the 1950s and beyond, a genocide that had been covered so extensively before the term was created, but was nevertheless described in horrific terms, describing the indescribable, if you like. By the 1950s, much of the world had forgotten, and there was often references to the Armenian genocide as the forgotten genocide. So we went from very high profile during World War I and after to, by half a century later, the forgotten genocide. Now, I'm pleased to say that 100 years after the genocide, 101 actually, it is very much remembered by more and more of the world. But you might want to think about why we remember and don't remember, and what role, if any, state denial has in that. The passage of time, changing borders, changing names, often deliberate changing of names. Now, I try, when I'm doing my work on genocide, to also bring in the concept of crimes against humanity, because, first of all, it's a term that was introduced relating to the Armenian genocide, but also because it's in many ways a more comprehensive net than the concept of genocide to capture the perpetrators and punish them. It includes more groups, and it includes individuals. Genocide is only targeting certain groups: ethnic, racial, religious, or national. There's a lot of groups that are left out. Genocide covers important things, but it doesn't cover enough. And similarly, we have the concept of war crimes. And the International Criminal Court, often when they charge individuals who are guilty, use the three concepts: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And I always remind people, you know, Al Capone, who conducted multiple murders, was convicted of income tax evasion. So it's not as satisfying to the victim group, but whatever net works to get the perpetrators, let's use it. And the more nets, the more mechanisms we have, the better. Now, I've handed out, because 15 minutes is not long to do a complex subject from 101 years ago, or today in some ways, because in some ways aspects of the genocide, particularly the denial continue, I provided a handout of 8 items. Several of them are from the newly published Armenian Genocide Encyclopedia that I edited over the last 6 years. And it's the first ever. You might want to think about why it took 100 years for the first ever encyclopedia about the Armenian Genocide to be published. And usually when we're talking about genocide, like other important topics, we have the journalistic or the academic W5 questions. Who, where, when, what, why, and we can add how. So we begin with who are the Armenians? And this is always a dilemma when you're talking about victim group, because inasmuch as genocide is successful, the victim group is smaller, more scattered, and maybe harder to survive and thrive. The Armenians are from the lands surrounding Mount Ararat in the South Caucasus. They were the first state, or the first nation to embrace Christianity in 301. And they have a unique language and alphabet. And in one of the handouts, you can see the verbs of genocide poem in English and in Armenian. You can see how different the script is. At its peak, the Armenian state, when it had independence, went from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the Black Sea in the north and the Caspian Sea in the east, so roughly a triangle. Now, over the centuries, the Armenian people were often the victims of competing empires, rival empires invading armies, and this is often the fate of nations that are smaller in number. And so we see that the Armenians were caught between the Greeks and the Persians, between Rome and Persia, between Russia and Persia, between Ottoman Empire and Tsarist Russia. On the eve of World War I, the Armenian people, the Armenian nation, was divided into 2 competing empires, the Tsarist Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. The western half of the Armenian nation was in the Ottoman Empire, and the eastern half was under the Tsarist Empire. And neither empires, the nature of empires is to dominate and subjugate other peoples, right? That's the nature of empire. So neither the Tsarist Empire nor the Ottoman Empire were particularly conducive to ethnic and linguistic and religious tolerance. But the genocide occurred not in the Tsarist half, but in the Ottoman half. And that's very, very important to remember. Now, when we look at factors explaining the rise of genocide, the causes of genocide, we can differentiate long-term, short-term, and there are usually lots and lots of factors, but I've highlighted 4 key ones. And you can decide whether these are similar to the causes of genocide elsewhere in the world. First, you had an enormously rigid ethnic and religious inequality in the Ottoman Empire. It was an autocratic regime. It was a theocratic regime where one religion had a higher, superior status, and the subject nations, the subject religious minorities, had far less rights. They were subjects, not citizens. This is one of the hardest concepts to teach to students in the 21st century, is the notion of a subject as opposed to a citizen, right? Basically, a subject had to obey often unjust laws, often unjust decrees. Now, the Ottoman Empire was one of the major empires of the last several thousand years. And at its peak, it was in North Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. But by the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, it had declined sufficiently that the number of diverse ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire had diminished as the Russian Empire expanded, as many of the Balkan states gained their independence. Now, the consequences of the Russian Tsarist expansion and Balkan states gaining their independence was the Muslims from those lands fled the repressive new regimes. And so you had people on the move, people who had lost their homes, lost their careers, very angry. So over 1 million refugees, Muslim refugees, came into that shrinking Ottoman Empire. And the state, the Ottoman state, deliberately put them into the lands that were historically the Armenian lands. Now, this is just adding fuel to the fire, right? Now, from the Ottoman regime point of view, it was putting fellow Muslims on the borders and making the lands more, if you like, friendly. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire, there was growing frustration, growing anger. You had this large displaced population from the Balkans and the southern parts of the expanding Tsarist Empire. And the Christians were seen as unreliable and scapegoats. You had to blame somebody, and if you were a forced refugee, you're not going to differentiate between a Serb Christian, a Croat Christian, or an Armenian Christian, right? So there was a tendency to scapegoat Christians, period. So you have a state inflaming ethnic intolerance and making a deliberate policy of population relocation, based in part because of the urgency of the migration, of forced migration of people. Now, as is often in the case of the history of Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, you had a coup, a violent revolution in 1908, and the Young Turks came to power. And the Young Turks were basically young military leaders who were unhappy with the decline of the empire, the old order that seemed inefficient, unable to stand up against the Europeans and others. And they thought they could modernize the empire, make it more efficient, more forceful, and expand the empire east back to Central Asia to compensate for the lost Balkan lands. Then the Young Turks' ideology was an intolerant form of nationalism. It was an expansionist policy of rebuilding an empire, conquering other peoples, in the goal of creating a pan-Turan. And it made extensive use of the army, the police, and special killing organizations to eliminate the Armenians. Now, those conditions would be sufficient, perhaps, but one key catalyst occurred that is the fourth factor, and that was World War I. War can often bring out the worst in state secrecy, arbitrariness, the sense of panic, the sense of feeling vulnerable. You lash out whoever your enemies, both external and suspected, accurate or not, suspected internal enemies. The Ottoman Empire felt threatened from Russia in the east, Britain and France and their fleets in the Mediterranean, the Arab revolt in the south, and the Greeks and Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. Now, 1915 is that fateful year, and we can see the phases of genocide. It was planned in secret. The regime lied about their intentions, so there was denial at the outset. And there were public state telegrams sent, and there were private party regime telegrams sent that contradicted the public telegrams. So you had kind of a public relations facade. And basically, those Armenian men who had been conscripted for the war were disarmed, sent into labor battalions where they worked like donkeys to carry loads, insufficient clothing, insufficient food. Many died fairly quickly from those conditions, but a great number of those conscripts, Armenian conscripts, were shot dead. So the men of military age were eliminated first. We have the law of deportations, temporary relocation. Don't worry, after the war, things will be fine, is publicly stated. Women and children and elderly were given 1 or 2 days' notice, not allowed to take very much, and sent on forced marches through the mountains and through the deserts of what is now Turkey, Syria, and parts of Iraq. And sometimes they were sent on deliberately circuitous routes. The goal was not to arrive at a destination, the goal was to kill them. And there was no setup of facilities for the women, the children, and the elderly. In that same year, we have the law of confiscation. Armenian properties, cattle, household goods were officially claimed by the state. Don't worry, they said, you'll get it back after the war. We'll keep a master list. In fact, usually the mobs, neighbors, grab the stuff, bargain sale. Kind of reminds me of the Japanese-Canadian plight during World War II, right? At the end, about 1.5 million Armenians died, either from exposure, starvation, disease, or outright killing. Many of the women were raped. Some of the women and children were stolen and taken into other families, Islamic families. Some were saved. A number of the Armenians who lived were saved by honest and very brave Islamic citizens, because the Turkish government said, you help an Armenian, your whole family will be punished at risk of death. How many of us would risk our families? It's one thing for me to risk my life, which I do from time to time, depending on where I'm going and what the nature of the regime is. But my family, my grandchildren, that's a different story. I'm a lot more cautious about my grandchildren than I am about myself, right? When we look at the genocide, it stopped in some ways. The killing stopped in some ways. But how? Foreign armies, the British and the French. It didn't stop from the regime changing its mind or running out of steam. And so you have to ask the question, hard power, as unpleasant as it is, may be necessary to intervene to save vulnerable ethnic, religious, racial communities. And we have the concept today of responsibility to protect, which the Canadian government and the Australian government help promote. As imperfect as a concept is and how it can be misused, it is an important future tool, I would argue. The harsh demographic reality is that there are more Armenians in the diaspora than in Turkey today. About 50,000 Armenians, vulnerable Armenians in Turkey today. Over 1,000 churches and monasteries were destroyed. We talk about cultural genocide. And Article 301 of the Turkish criminal law can charge you for insulting Turkishness. And insulting Turkishness can be a variety of things included, but one is to talk about the Armenian genocide. And I would just conclude my initial talk by just saying this. The attempt to silence is not only in Turkey today, 101 years later, directed at academics, civil society types, human rights activists, but reaches out across the globe. Every major Armenian genocide scholar that I know who's been in the field for at least 10 years has received threats to his or herself or family, myself included. 8 years ago, the Turkish government tried to silence me in Canada, threatened me with loss of my job, and even worse, threatened the Canadian government if they didn't silence me. And you won't hear me say very much positive about the Harper government. But this is one time that stubborn man did something right. I said no, and I'm grateful for that. And I am able to stand here today because of other people standing up in solidarity. And we need to stand up in solidarity for those in Turkey today, because they are much more vulnerable.